Okay, hi everyone. We are going to get started here. This is a two-parter, effectively. Um, it is it's a section that's on selection decisions and personnel law. So the first half is going to be about how do you basically make the choice to hire someone, what decisions or what factors should come into play. And then personnel law, which gets at the legal precedents that should impact the decisions that you make. This will be a long one because there's a lot involved in both of these, so just fair warning. So I already went through that. Warning, I will not cover everything in the book, even though this is a super long lecture. There's stuff that I've brought in that is not in the book and vice versa, so it's incumbent on you to read the book and listen to this lecture. So let's talk about selection decisions. So an overview of the process that we've been talking about is right here. As you can see, job analysis is the root of everything that we've been talking about thus far. And in terms of the topics that we have covered and will cover, job analysis informs our recruitment efforts, so who we try to get to fill a job, our selection efforts, so who we hire in that job, which also informs, or is rather, it trickles down into our prediction of who is going to perform well as our assessment of applicants. And then job analysis, obviously, which we've already talked about, impacts our performance assessment. So this also relates to our gauging of whether someone needs training, whether someone should be promoted, how much they should be compensated, and whether they should be fired. So let's go. So we're going to start first with a discussion of recruitment. We've already talked about these things here, though some of it will come up when we talk about our legal issues in a little bit, but later, or we'll talk about selection after we talk about recruitment. So recruitment is the process by which we encourage and solicit potential applicants to seek employment within our organization. So it's how we get people to apply for the jobs within our organizations. There are two things that influence the decision to apply for a job in an organization and accept that job, and that's person environment fit and person job fit. Basically, when you're recruiting people, you're obviously trying to identify people who are going to be well suited for your job, but you also want people to believe that they will be a good fit within your organization and within the job. So let's first talk about person environment fit. Person environment fit relates to whether a recruit thinks, an applicant, a job applicant or a recruit thinks that they will fit within your organization's culture and your values. And this can start through a number of mediums, especially now in an age where we have so much information about companies that we are trying to work for. This can start with reputation. So what's the reputation of the company? Would you want to work at a place like Facebook, given all its pros and cons of working there? Would you want to work at a place like Procter & Gamble or Dow Chemical or anywhere? Because all of those companies have different reputations. We can also see through social media how our recruits will perceive our organization. So organizations have their own social media presences now, and it's through their presence on social media that we can come to understand who the organization is and what they value and what they don't. Word of mouth is also another way that we can learn about an organization and whether we would want to apply for a job there. So this is more informal based on, current or former employees' perceptions of working at that organization. And then of course there's just internet sources like Glassdoor or just the web page of the organization itself. The web page giving you, once again, more of that information about the values and culture of the organization, but also places like Glassdoor giving you an idea of how former and current employees feel about working there. So that's person environment fit. Like I said, it's about your perception of whether you'll fit in with the values and the culture of the organization. Then there's person job fit. This is the extent to which a person feels that they will fit with the job or position that they have. So this is about the actual job or work that you will be doing. So how does this happen during recruitment? Well, obviously a job posting gives me an idea of whether I would be a good fit for the job. I look at the knowledge, skills, abilities, responsibilities, and tasks provided in the job post, and I say, do I have those things? Most reasonable people look at a job post and say, I can do those things and I therefore should apply, or I do check those boxes and I should apply, or they realize, I don't fit the bill here, so I'm going to move on and not apply. This also happens through word of mouth. So you can talk with people who have had the job or currently have the job that you want to apply for or are considering applying for. And this can happen if we consider interviews to not only be a test or predictor of performance, but also an opportunity to recruit people to join your organization. Then an interview can offer an opportunity to provide a realistic job preview. A realistic job preview being where you give applicants an idea of what their work would be. Sometimes when faculty at universities are applying for jobs, we have meetings with graduate students. We teach classes, and while this also provides an opportunity to effectively a work sample or a performance test, it also allows us to see what would my job be like here? What kinds of students am I going to work with? What other faculty am I going to work with? And realistic job previews are a really good way to ensure that you're not getting people who have no idea what's expected of them, because we want to avoid turnover. We want to avoid people quitting their job because it's expensive. Turnover is extremely expensive. Losing good talent, extremely expensive. But why do these also matter in terms of employee satisfaction? Well, if you don't feel like you fit in a company's culture, if you don't feel like you are well suited for a job, you are going to become dissatisfied. You're going to have lower job satisfaction. You'll also have a lower commitment to your organization. And these things can in turn lead you to develop intentions to quit or plans to leave your organization, and it can have a negative impact on your performance. So identifying people who are well suited for your company's culture as well as the job itself is really critical. It's costly when you have employees who aren't performing well, and it's costly when you have people leaving your organization. So we can recruit people using formal channels. We can also recruit people using informal channels. Informal channels do present some problems. Many companies do encourage referrals. You may have worked for a company yourself where you've seen that they encourage referrals, and you may even get a commission if someone gets hired that you recommended. But the issue is we tend to know people like ourselves, and we're therefore more likely to recommend people who are similar to us on variables that do matter. Things like race, ethnicity, and national origin, educational background, and socioeconomic status. So we have to be careful, because as we visit in the legal section, if you develop a selection system that relies primarily on things like word of mouth and internal referrals, you may find yourself hiring people who are similar, and in that sense engaging in adverse impact, or rather using a selection tool that results in adverse impact. And when that happens, you open yourself up to be liable to a lawsuit. So we really have to be careful. And even if we don't get sued, we really have to ask ourselves, do I want an organization full of homogenous people who look the same, act the same, went to the same schools, have the same background, and don't really offer any form of diversity? Because diversity is, yes, it's surface level, but it's also so much more than that. And so if you're relying on informal recruitment processes and informal channels, you do run the risk of not diversifying your organization in ways that are meaningful. And that includes surface level diversity as well as other forms of diversity and psychological diversity. So one quick caveat, social media. Social media is a really interesting landscape. And I think, let me just double check. I think we're going to get into this. So people use people's social media activities to gauge whether they will be a good employee somewhere. And this is an ethical and legal quagmire for sure. It's something that my colleagues and I have actually written about, whether organizations should be firing employees for things that they do outside of work. But we all know that when we go on the job market, organizations are going to be looking for us on social media. And, this happens with a lot of celebrities. People mine their tweets, they mine their Instagram posts or their Tumblr posts and try to find something that they've said in the past. You also have, there was a pretty well-known example of a PR executive who sent a racist tweet to only 200 followers, and then, By the time she landed in Africa, she had become a national, infamous, I don't want to say star, but she'd almost become um, a celebrity, if you will, if you use that term generously, for this tweet that she sent out. So we know that companies use what we have done on social media either to make employment decisions about people who are currently employed. We also know that they look at our social media activity when they are deciding whether to hire us. The reason I bring this up is it's also part of potentially, it probably should have been included in the selection and predictors section, but this is such an interesting quagmire, and a lot of places haven't really quite formalized this use of social media, so it doesn't really fit well anywhere. So if this seems a little bit off track, I do apologize. But if this is something that interests you, both the pros and cons of firing people or making employment decisions based on people who have made misguided at best and racist and sexist social media posts at worst, then I recommend reading this book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. John Ronson has written a lot about social media activities and people being punished for them, and it's a really, really fascinating book. It's a really good and easy read. I really recommend it, especially for a generation that finds themselves on social media a lot. It offers a lot of lessons as well as basically warnings about maybe the extent to which we put stuff on social media. So I really, really can't recommend that book enough. So we do use social media in the process of cyber vetting. We use social media to make selection decisions, and sometimes we even use them to make termination decisions, who we should fire and who we shouldn't. It's almost the equivalent, if you will, to an integrity test, because we may say that people's social media posts give me an idea of their character. It may not necessarily predict their job performance, but could it actually? We may say to ourselves, well, what people put on social media can give me an idea of how conscientious they are. Are they prudent? Are they judicious in what they share and what they don't? Do they have integrity and honesty? So if the vision that they present in an interview doesn't align with what's on social media, is this an honest person? Are you getting what you see? And is what you see is what you get? It also, like I said, can tap into things like prudence and good decision making. We really have to ask ourselves if somebody who thinks at any point it was appropriate to share social media content that's laden with racial epithets, if that person would actually make a good employee, and are they capable of making good decisions. In some ways, I guess it's great because now you've identified someone who is definitely a racist by, say, sharing racial epithets via social media. But going back to the idea of an integrity test, we want people who know, hey, I probably shouldn't share these abhorrent ideas that I have on social media. It also could get into something like foresight. Do you have the ability to think ahead? Think about what your decisions are going to do. What impact are they going to have? So there might be some things that social media posts tap into, and in that way, looking at it could be job related. But it does present some problems. You could be dealing with violations of employee and applicant privacy. And one of the big issues is that the courts just really have not given any definitive guidance as to when we can utilize an employee's social media activities for the purposes of employment decisions. Like I say here, it's a legal quagmire. A lot of people wonder, and this is particularly relevant for federal and public employees, how much of the policing of people's social media activity is effectively a First Amendment rights violation. So that's another issue. Another issue is, are you losing good talent? So let's move aside from some of the things that are decidedly problematic, like sexism and racism. What if you see someone who just posts pictures of themselves at a party, at a bar with drinks in hands, or, being a woo girl, if you will? Are you losing good talent? Are you potentially judging someone for their behaviors outside of work that hopefully wouldn't have an impact on their performance, are you judging them just because you don't like the fact that they maybe go to a bar and have a good time? So in that way, we could run the risk, like I said, barring the decidedly really bad things like racism and sexism, if you see something that you say, well, that's probably not the best thing to share on social media, but it isn't actually morally problematic, you may find yourself losing good talent who just are bad at their social media game. And then another issue that you could deal with, and this is something that my colleagues and I have somewhat touched on, is what does it say as an organization if you knowingly hire someone or don't fire someone who has done problematic things on social media? So the flip side is, what if you decide to look past someone's problematic posts? What does it say to your other employees that, you've made this choice? So let's say you hired someone knowing that in the past they had shared sexist tweets and that they had retweeted sexist tweets and followed a lot of misogynistic accounts. What does it say if you bring that person on, if they apologize for their actions, but you still choose to bring them on into your organization? It may say to the women in your organization that they are not valued and that sexism isn't that much of a deal breaker for you. So you have to be aware of this. Like I said, this is a really problematic issue, and it's really hard to say what employers and HR managers should be doing when it comes to social media posts. We can't ignore it, but do we open ourselves up for a lawsuit if we do? Do we open ourselves up for a lawsuit if we don't do anything about what we see? So you should stay tuned, because I imagine in the next 5 years or so, we'll start to see decisions being handed down by the courts about whether this is or isn't appropriate. So back to your regularly scheduled programming. That was a little bit of a caveat. So let's go into how to make a selection decision. So how do we know that we're doing a good job, but also I don't want to be sued? Because you need to, make sure that you are selecting the best employees, because that makes financial sense. But if you aren't making sound selection decisions, you do open yourself up to be sued for discrimination, for hiring people for reasons that aren't valid. So in our exercise this past Thursday, October, just to give you an idea, October 1st, we took the validity coefficients of the predictors that we were using and we squared them and we summed them. And I said this wasn't quite the best way to do it, but it gave you an idea of how much coverage your selection system would have. The reason that it's not perfect, and usually it adds up to, or the reason it was then adding up to more than 1.0, which it can't possibly statistically or realistically, is that usually there's some overlap between the predictors that we're using, and it doesn't usually fully cover the criterion space. So here we see, for example, that if we use an assessment center and a work sample and an interview, that there would be some overlap, that these things would be tapping into the same, not only variance in each other, but also variance within the criterion, in this case, job performance. So here we can see that when we are looking at a selection system, we basically, if we're looking at this Venn diagram here, we want to see our predictors. Here we have 3 of them: work sample, assessment center, and interview. We want to see them cover as much of this criterion performance, or performance criterion right here. Here it does a pretty good job. Actually, having an R-squared of 0.55 is pretty good. So that basically means that half of the variance, so half of the differences we observe in job performance, we are predicting using a work sample or an assessment center and the interview. And like I said, that's really good. That we would kill for that, basically, to have an assessment, a selection battery that can do that. So that's why, for example, I would have, and we'll revisit this in another activity, but that's why usually our, validity coefficients, when we square them, they usually, if we put them all together into a system to account for criterion performance, it won't add up to more than 1.0. It couldn't, because you would start to get overlap, all this overlap on the criterion or the performance criterion. So when we're doing, when we're looking at the predictors that we use and the tests that we use in our selection system, we need to validate them. And there are different ways that we can validate them. These include predictive validation, concurrent validation, cross-validation, validity generalization, and synthetic validation. So predictive validation is about looking to the future. That's why it's predictive. You basically take your current round of applicants, so job applicants that you have, and you measure them on the predictors that you are currently using. So let's say you use an interview and just an application blank, and then the new predictors. So let's say that's an interview, an application blank, a cognitive ability test, and a work sample. So now you hire some of your applicants, presumably using the highest scores that they achieved on your current prediction. So in this case, the application and the interview. Now, in a few months later, you collect some performance data and you calculate your validity coefficient. So you see how much the new predictors, so the application blank, interview, work sample, and cognitive ability test, you see how much those predict subsequent job performance. Ideally, we would want to see our validity coefficient between our current set of predictors and our proposed new set of predictors be different, where the proposed new set of predictors would have a higher validity coefficient. Concurrent validation, on the other hand, is where you take some of your current employees, ideally all or at least those who have this particular position or job family, and you collect data at the same time on both the predictors that you plan on using, so let's say cognitive ability, a work sample, interview, and application, and their current job performance. And then you compute, so you calculate a validity coefficient between those predictors, those four I've mentioned, and the outcome, which in this case is their current job performance. So that's the difference. Here we're trying to predict to the future, so we measure something at one time, we collect data later, and we see how much that time one measure predicts the time two measure. Here we're collecting it all at the same time. And so there are pros and cons to each of these. With predictive validation, it takes a lot of time. And, we talked about, well, what do I do if I have, I'm trying to hire new employees and I don't want to make mistakes? You may then say, well, I'll do a concurrent validation study on the people I do have. So this tends to be a little bit easier to do a concurrent validation, but at the same time, you may end up with range restriction and you may have a higher estimate of your validity coefficient because you've already hired these people. So we know that they are the best of the best. We know that they're already going to be strong on both the predictors and presumably the outcomes since they've been hired. So it may unduly influence the validity coefficient that you see. Another way we can do this is cross-validation, and we look at validity shrinking. So our selection procedures will never be, statistically speaking, as valid as they were when we first assessed them. It's just, that's usually what we observe. So we need to figure out how much they have deteriorated as we use them. So we develop our selection system, we generate a validity coefficient that tells us, hey, the validity coefficient of our selection system is 0.75, if we go back here, I think that's what it is here, or 0.74. Yeah, 0.74. So we have that validity. And now we want to see, okay, if we add another thing to if we go ahead and collect, or rather hire more people, does the validity coefficient still reasonably hold up? And so there are a couple of ways that we can do this. One way is an empirical way, which is you create a regression equation between your predictors and your outcome variables, so using one sample of employees. So you basically create an equation that would allow you to predict performance based on what you have observed with your current set of employees. So you collect that predictor data, you collect the outcome data, performance data in other words, and you generate that equation that if I were to then put in predictor data for new applicants and new hires, I would then be able to generate a predicted score of for their performance. And so we create this regression equation, and then we use another set of employees and we test them on the predictors again. We get their expected performance scores, like I said, and then we assess their performance scores and we correlate it with the predicted scores. So basically, we've generated this first regression equation. We hire some people before we do that, we measure them on the predictors, and then we generate their predicted performance score. Then a few months later, we measure their actual performance and see, did the people that we think were going to be high performers end up being high performers? Did the people that we thought were going to be, or did the people that we thought were going to be poor performers end up being poor performers as well? We would want to see a strong level of a correlation there. If we see that it's not actually doing a good job, that the people we predicted to be good performers are not performing well, then we would have to revisit our selection system. Another way to do it is just statistically. I won't go into this, but this is just where you correct the validity coefficient for measurement errors. So errors in the way you measure your predictors. Now you might be saying, do I have to do this? This seems like a lot of work. I don't like math. I don't like wasting time or money collecting data. Maybe not. And this is where validity generalization comes in. Validity generalization argues that we can rely on validity studies, so these studies of whether a predictor actually predicts job performance. We can rely on studies done in other organizations and in other contexts. So you may not necessarily have to. And if you are in a startup, I talked about this earlier, what do you do if you're in a startup and you don't have any of this performance data? Validity generalization may help you out because you can rely on other studies that have looked at predictors and whether they predict performance. This does, though, open you up to some legal challenges because the safest way to ensure that you will not get sued is to do internal validation studies to make sure that your predictors actually predict performance in your organization. And of course, you still need a job analysis. So you would need to prove that the job you are using these other studies for is similar to the jobs being studied in those studies. So for example, if I wanted to hire a marketing director in my new startup, but I don't have the data, I could look at other studies that have looked at predicting job performance in marketing, in a marketing director. And I would have to, though, do a job analysis of my marketing director's job to make sure that it is similar enough to the jobs being studied in the validity study that I am looking at. So if the validity study did other marketing directors and I can demonstrate that it's roughly the same, great. Or let's say if I wanted to look for a VP of branding, but there's really been no studies on predicting job performance in VPs of branding, you might say, okay, well, there have been studies though on marketing directors, and you would have to prove using job analysis that the job of a VP of branding is very similar to that of a director of marketing. So you still need job analysis. You can't just not do job analysis. It still informs whether you can use other studies to justify using predictors to predict performance in a job. There's also synthetic validity. This has not been really well supported, but it is an alternative. Here you just identify the job components, so what is required in the activities of the job, and there will be systems that help you identify common KSAOs to predict those job components. So if we know, for example, that your job involves interfacing with clients, and we know that verbal communication and persuasion are probably two KSAOs that would be important, then we would select based on those KSAOs, and we would use selection tools that have been validated in other contexts before. So this would just help you even without someone doing, you still probably have to do a job analysis by doing the job components, but then you could use common KSAOs to predict those components and then, select on the tools and measures used. I don't recommend this, and I don't think a lot of IO psychologists recommend it either, but it exists. So now you're thinking, okay, well, I understand how I can validate my selection system. And let's say that I've, shown that we're predicting a decent amount of the performance in our employees. We have pretty strong validity coefficients. So what do I do? How do I now decide who am I going to hire? How can I move forward with confidence that my hiring choices are going to be good? Because it can be hard to make these choices, and you also want to make sure that you don't go down a slippery slope of making bad choices based on things that don't matter, like nepotism. Nepotism is a really common thing that still happens, and you need to make sure that you avoid just making bad, ill-advised decisions, like hiring people you're related to just because they're related to you. So how to decide who to hire. The two techniques we're going to talk about are multiple cutoffs and multiple regression. So multiple cutoffs. Multiple cutoffs refer to, let's see, okay. So multiple cutoffs refer to when you have basically different cutoff scores for your predictors. And so the only way in a multiple cutoff score that you would ever be offered a job is if you, that's the hurdle. Just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Okay. Is if you met the, if you met all of the cutoff scores here. So I, for example, thought that I actually got this highlighted, but I did not. So here, in order to have a multiple cutoff, you have to, like I said, meet all of the cutoff scores for each of your criteria. And then whoever is left in your selection system, you would then hire based on how well they performed overall. So once you've seen who has satisfied all of these cutoffs, then you look to their total score. So if we look here, we can see we have these predictor cutoff scores and we have to see who met these cutoffs. So here we can see that Suki did not meet the cutoff for the assessment center, so she would be out of the running. Neither did Saka, so he would be out of the running as well. If we look at the bio data predictor, we see that the cutoff score is 3, so everyone's good. For cognitive ability, the cutoff score is 5. Saka was the only person who didn't meet that cutoff, and he was already kicked out by the assessment center. The next one is a personality test. The cutoff is a 4. Here we see that Aang scored pretty low, so he is removed from the running. And then we have an integrity test where the score needs to be a 5 or above, and here we see that Zuko is cut out. So the only people who remain are Katara and Toph. Katara with a score of 37, Toph with a score of 36.5. So we would probably offer the job to Katara first and then Toph second. Another way to do this, though, is, which I have them highlighted here. Another way to do this, though, is multiple hurdles. So you have then, instead of analyzing everybody on all of the predictors, you give them hurdles. And this happens for some of you, right? You provide an application blank and a resume, and then only some of you get invited for an interview. We can't possibly interview all of our applicants, and this is a cost-effective measure of determining who's going to be a good employee. So here we can also have, you have a cutoff score, and as a person, goes through the rounds, the order of the hurdles, basically, we remove them if they don't meet our cutoff scores. Cutoff scores, of course, also have to be justified using job analysis and data and prediction. So here for the assessment center, for the first hurdle, we have the cognitive ability test. We see the cutoff score is 5, so the only person who got kicked out was Sokka. The next one is the assessment center. The cutoff score is 2.5, so Suki gets cut out, which leaves us with just these 4 individuals here. The next one is the bio data. The cutoff score is 3. All of our applicants satisfy that cutoff score. The next one is the integrity test. The cutoff score is 5. Zuko did not meet that, so Toph, Katara, and Aang are the only people who remain. And then the last one is personality, which Aang does not satisfy that cutoff score. So once again, we're left with Katara and Toph. So here we came up with pretty much the same outcomes that we did before, but we can also imagine that reordering it could change at least, who your top 3 are, who gets cut out when. I think that's all I would want to say on that. And the reason that multiple hurdles, like I said and alluded to, could be beneficial is that you save money because you're not measuring everyone on everything. You're not doing interviews with everyone. If we had an interview in our selection system, or here we have an assessment center, which probably wouldn't do first because that's super expensive. But if you did that last, you would only save it for the people who've actually met all of these hurdles. Another way to do this, and I mentioned before, is multiple regression. So multiple regression is where we take, presumably using either incumbents or a certain round of applicants, we collect their data on our predictors, which we have listed up here, and then we collect their performance scores later, and we generate a regression equation where Y gives us a predicted performance score, so how much we think or how well we think they will perform. And here we've generated, using statistical analyses, these weights for each portion of the selection system. So when we've generated our multiple regression equation, we can enter then these scores in here, and we can enter our scores in here, and it gives us basically a predicted score of how well people will perform. I should say that multiple hurdles and multiple cutoffs are non-compensatory. So if you don't do well in one of these things, you can't compensate by doing well in something else. So for example, Zuko is really good in terms of personality and cognitive ability, but terrible in terms of integrity. Those things can't compensate for each other. If he doesn't pass the cutoff for an integrity score, it doesn't matter how great his, personality scores are, how great his cognitive ability scores are, he's going to be cut out. On the other hand, with multiple regression, we can see the potential for compensation to take place. So here we see the predicted score, and what we would do then is rank order people based on their predicted scores. Once again, this is pretty similar to what we saw, though Aang comes out actually a little bit ahead of Toph here. But this is roughly what we saw with using our other methods. Katara would be number 1, Aang number 2, Toph number 3, Suki number 4, Zuko number 5, and poor Sokka at the bottom. But we can also combine these, right? Because we may say to ourselves, hey, like, I don't want someone for this job who isn't meeting a certain level of intelligence. And let's say you get like a really bad round of applicants. This does happen from time to time. You look at all of your applicants and say, well, this is what the score showed and this is how they're ranking. But when you look at the actual data, you realize, oh my gosh, they're not scoring well at all on anything if we look at it in an absolute sense as opposed to a relative sense. So here we may say, okay, I want these people to meet these predictor cutoffs as well as, get a certain, have high scores. And here we would end up once again with the same people, with Katara and Toph being the ones who meet these cutoffs. And then we would give, offer the job to Katara first and then Toph second. Aang would actually, even though his predicted score is very high, would be kicked out of the system, or we wouldn't offer the job to him, because we would say we need people who are getting at least a 4 out of 10 on their personality test, and he's just not meeting it. Or even Suki, we would say, hey, we need someone who at least gets a 2.5 on the assessment center, and she got a 0. That's unacceptable. No matter how high her score is, we're not going to offer her the job. And so these are important things to consider. The book talks about, this is kind of a joke, and for the record, yes, it is pulled from Avatar: The Last Airbender. But in real jobs with real people, things like surgeons, things like airline pilots, we probably don't want compensatory measures, or we at the very least want to make sure that our airline pilots have a sufficient knowledge of airline technology and how to operate an airplane. We don't want to have compensation going on. So you really have to be deliberate and thoughtful about the job at hand and what risks you take if you allow people to get through because you're just using a multiple regression approach. So this then brings us to an important question. If you become the new VP of HR, if you are part of a company that is having some selection issues, you need to ask yourself, should I change my selection system? And the answer to that is it really depends. You have to make a lot of considerations, and we'll talk about some of those factors that you consider right now. So first, we need to think about utility, how cost efficient and useful selection battery is. So how much money are we using, and is it actually predicting good performance? Part of this is we need to also consider accuracy. So I just took a picture of this from the book because I did not want to bother recreating it. Here we have this depiction of accuracy. Now, with accuracy, here we go. Does it come up later? I just want to see. Okay, we talk about it a little bit later. But with accuracy, we are interested in understanding how many hits are we getting? So how many hires are we getting who are actually going to be successful on the job? How many false alarms? So how many people do we hire who are actually not going to be good on the job? And then how many people are we going to, just want to see, yeah, okay. Then how many people do we miss? So how many people would have been good on the job, but our selection system just didn't identify them? And then how many people did we appropriately decide to reject who would have performed poorly? Now, we may look at, and for certain jobs, different things may be more important. So for example, once again, with an air traffic controller or a pilot or even someone in the military, we really want to make sure that, yes, we have hits, but we actually don't want a lot of false alarms. There's a lot that can go wrong when you hire someone who is going to be bad at the job. And that we would be much more willing to take some misses if it meant that we wouldn't get these false alarms here, that we wouldn't be hiring people who are definitely wrong for the job. So we can also assess then our selection system's accuracy, looking at something like the decision accuracy for hires. So looking at basically how many hits did you have over all of the people you hired. So basically dividing this quadrant one divided by quadrant three, divided by quadrant three plus quadrant one. Another way that we could assess accuracy is to look at the overall decision accuracy. So we look at quadrant one, so how many people did we appropriately hire, how many people did we appropriately reject over all of the people that were in our selection system. The hard part is it's really hard to obviously gauge whether someone would have been a miss. You're not going to collect performance data on them. So this is more like a projection or a projection of what it would be. Like I said, it's really, you can't collect performance data on people that you reject. So this is more of a projection or an assumption of what we would have seen. So another thing that we would consider in deciding whether we needed to actually change our selection system is the base rate. So how many employees are achieving acceptable levels of performance using your current selection system? So if you have a selection system where 80% of your employees are already performing at acceptable standards, you may not want to invest the time or money in developing a new selection system. On the other hand, you may say to yourself, well, we only have a 30% or 25% acceptable performance base rate. We probably need to bump that up. And you would probably be right. Of course, though, it can be super expensive. So another thing we finally need to consider, or not finally, there's one more thing. Another thing we consider is the selection ratio. So how many openings are you going to have and how many applicants do you have? If you have 10 openings and 10 applicants, you're basically, and you have to fill those openings immediately or rather soon, you're probably just going to accept all of those applicants. So would it be beneficial to redesign your selection system if you're just going to accept everyone anyway? Probably not. So these are important questions to ask. If, however, you are only accepting, say, 10% of your applicants, then you may want to make sure that, hey, the 10% we're accepting, we are doing a really good job at accepting, and that we're being judicious and cautious in who and how we evaluate them. Cost is also a relevant consideration. How much money would it take to implement a new selection system, to even just research it? These are relevant concerns as to whether it would be worth it to change your selection. So putting this all together, you can look at the Taylor-Russell tables in your book. This is table 7.5 in chapter 7. Here, this gives you an idea of how much you can improve theoretically the base rate of performance, or rather the base rate of acceptable performance in your organization if you do change your selection system. So let's say we've collected our data on our predictors and our criterion, performance. We know what our base rate of performance is. Let's say it's 30%. So we're only getting acceptable performance for 30% of our employees. And we know that we're going to select half of the applicants who apply. So we have a selection ratio of 0.5. And like I said, our current base rate is 30%. If we have a validity coefficient, I've already forgotten the one that I threw out, so I'm also just going to say 0.3 for our validity coefficient and a selection rate of 0.5. If we look at the table, we can see then that we will only improve our base rate by 8% because it will only go up to 38%. So you may ask yourself, is 8% improvement worth it? If you're in a high stakes field like surgery or being an airline pilot, you may say, yes, we want that, we need that. We can't, this means death if people aren't good at their jobs. And so in that way, it might be worth it. But if it's just for a sales clerk at a store, that's no shade on sales clerks, it's just usually not a life and death situation, then we may say it's not worth it to us to increase the base rate, or the theoretical base rate of acceptable performance in our organization. So this gives you just an idea of whether it's useful for you to actually change your selection system. So here is the second half of our lecture. So this gives you, so what we've talked about thus far is how can we make prudent decisions in hiring people, and whether we should even change our systems to hire people. There are legal issues, though, that should influence the decisions you make in an organization. And This can be overwhelming because things change constantly. Case law gets overturned, it gets reinterpreted, Congress issues new laws, states issue new laws. And so you have to be aware of the changes that go on in a legal landscape. I used to follow, I don't have the time to anymore, but SCOTUS blog was always really helpful for me to follow what was going on in the Supreme Court and keep up to date on decisions being made. So I recommend that to you all as well. So legal issues. There are a few key pieces of information and sources that we draw from when we are deciding how we should make decisions in employment contexts that will be legal. These include the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the EEOC Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, PSYOP's Principles for the Validation and Use of Personnel Selection, case law, and Supreme Court decisions. PSYOP's principles are not legally binding. Everything else, though, usually is a pretty strong legal precedence, or it is the legal precedence itself. So we'll go over what some of these are. So one concept, though, that we want to get out of the way is the idea of employment at will. This is a concept that has long roots. You can basically be fired or hired under this precedent for any reason or no reason at all. Usually we use it to refer to what happens with firing, that someone could fire you for your clothes, the way you talk, or just giving someone a weird look, or just not showing up to work one day. You can be fired theoretically, this is a theory, or a principle, theoretically speaking, for any of these things. But not, there are limits to this, and we'll get to what those are because they have legal precedents. You can't do it, you can't be fired for your clothes, but not if it's related to your race, ethnicity, or religion. So you've had women who wear hijabs who are not hired for positions that they were qualified for, and that's discrimination based on religion. You can be fired for the way you talk, but not if it, once again, is related to your race, ethnicity, or national origin. To fire someone based on their accent, that's discrimination. So there are limits to the concept of employment at will. Another concept that we would be wary of is the concept of adverse impact. Adverse impact gets at the impact of selection decisions on underrepresented groups. And adverse impact is something that we need to be aware of and constantly calculating when we work in HR and when we are IO psychologists in organizations. Because anyone can sue you for adverse impact even if you didn't mean for it to happen. So adverse impact basically emerges when you see that there's a meaningfully different rate of hiring people between different groups. So are you hiring white people far more often, white applicants I should say, far more often than you're hiring black applicants, than you're hiring Asian applicants? Are you hiring male applicants far more often than you're hiring female applicants? And for the record, it isn't just, majority versus minority. You could theoretically have a case where, women are being hired more frequently for a job than men, and that could also be adverse impact. So with adverse impact, we can look at the 80% rule. The 80% rule gets at, that 4/5 of the selection rate of the comparison or referent group has been met in the other group. And I know that's kind of hard to understand, so let's illustrate it. So here we have a sample selection system, who was the applicant ID, who was hired, and what their race was. This is once again assuming a very limited concept of what race is, with people only identifying as one race. With the growing number of people who are biracial, multi-ethnic, and whatnot in our country, this is going to be very complicated as we move forward as HR and IO professionals. So here we look at the selection ratio. It's 3 out of 9 or you can see for the record that 4 individuals were hired, 3 were white, and 1 was Asian. We can see that the selection ratio of the applicants was 3 out of 9 for the white applicants. And that, if we do a 80% rule or 4/5 rule, that gets us at 0.26 or 26% ratio, or 26% ratio. And then we have 1 out of 9 for the Asian group. So that's 11%. If we compare everyone to white people, no group would pass the 80% rule, because what this would mean is every other group would have to be selected at 26% or greater. And even the only other group that was selected, Asian individuals, did not pass that. So everybody else, Hispanic, Latinx, and Black individuals, would not pass the 80% rule. Now you might be saying to yourself, hey, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, this is a really small sample. Like, is this really fair to sue an organization when they had 9 applicants and they made, these choices, you would be right. And that's why the 80% rule has generally fallen out of favor with the courts. And so there are some more precise rules that we can use, and that if you became an IO or HR professional, you would become accustomed to. So one of those includes the 2 standard deviation rule. This doesn't necessarily look at who was hired per se, it looks at the scores that they receive on a selection tool, so interviews, cognitive ability tests, and then looks at the standard deviation and to see if whether the average score of other subgroups was more than 2 standard deviations different than the comparison group. So let's say we assess cognitive ability in our selection procedure, which most of us would do, and that the applicant pool average was about 3.5 and standard deviation was about 1.2. Here, if we look, we can see that the average of our white applicants was 1.2, the average of our black applicants was 4.2, et cetera. We go down this list. If the standard deviation is 1.2, what this would mean is that our applicants would need to have, like I said, less than 2.4 point difference here, because that's 2 times the standard deviation. So if we're comparing everyone to our highest scoring group, in this case, the Asian or Pacific Islander individuals, anyone who is below 2.1 on the, anyone who is below 2.1 on their, on this measure would be outside of the realm of acceptable, practices. Basically, there would be adverse impact, in other words. And so here we would see, using that, like I said, 2 times the standard deviation, that's why it's a 2 standard deviation rule. 2 times the standard deviation is 2.4. 4.5 minus 2.4 is 2.1, unless my math is wrong. So the white group would have experienced adverse impact, and the Native American person, the Native persons group, and the Indigenous persons group would have also considered adverse impact, but not the Black or African group, and not the Hispanic and Latinx group. And of course, you can compare it to other groups. So we would still say that the white group suffered adverse impact relative to the Black applicants too. So there can be multiple comparison groups going on here. And here, this can give us an idea of, whether there's adverse impact going on. Of course, this doesn't look at who's actually being hired, which is also a critical consideration. So that's why some people use something known as the Fisher's exact test. The point is, the Fisher's exact test is pretty complicated. I can send it to people if they want to, but here it's really good for small sample sizes because it looks at the relative and comparative proportions of people in a way that's a little bit more precise than just the 80% rule. But there are other ways that the courts deal with small sample sizes, so we're not dealing with these issues. The point here is that when you are an IO and HR professional, you do need to be very diligent about keeping this kind of data, because you want to, make sure you're not going to be suddenly sued for adverse impact. It's also critical to collect this data, because we'll see in a second that the only way one of the ways an organization can refute a claim of adverse impact is by providing their own data and analyses. So let's say you work for a company and you believe that there is adverse impact, or rather you tried to get a job with a company and you believe there is adverse impact. How can you establish an adverse impact case? Well, first, you as the plaintiff would need to just demonstrate a prima facie case of adverse impact. So you would have to show some data indicating that people are not being selected proportionally in an underrepresented group. The defendant, in this case the organization, needs to rebut the claim using other data or analyses, which gets to my previous point. The plaintiff, you, has to refute that using other statistical analyses. And if you can't, you lose. Or if the defendant can't rebut the claim using other data and analyses, they would probably lose, unless they acknowledge that there is adverse impact, but they defend the job relevance of the test. This is why a lot of organizations can continue to use cognitive ability tests, even though they disproportionately disfavor people of color relative to white people, because we can continue to show, though, they do a really good job of predicting job performance. And so in that way, organizations can kind of wipe their hands clean of it all. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't try to change things, for the record, but that's how this happens. So the defendant can acknowledge it, but say, hey, this is relevant to the job and we have the data to prove it. And then the plaintiff, and this is where it gets tricky, you, the plaintiff, have to just argue, well, this is a pretext for discrimination. One way you could do this for something like a cognitive ability test is say, hey, use college GPA to assess whether, cognitive ability, research shows that that has far less adverse impact. And that's a tactic that some plaintiffs use, is they show there are other tests that you could use to get at the thing you want to measure that don't result in adverse impact. And that's how sometimes companies can lose. And that's why it's important to keep up to date on what research is showing about whether tests are predicting performance or not. Now, for adverse impact, intention doesn't necessarily matter. And we'll talk about the case law for that in a second. But for adverse impact, it doesn't matter if you meant to discriminate against people. If your selection system results in you discriminating against people, you can get sued. Disparate treatment, on the other hand, is where there is an intent to discriminate against people, and different standards are applied to different groups in a selection context. So like I said, this is different from adverse impact because adverse impact occurs when the same procedure is applied. So everybody takes the same cognitive ability test, but its effects produce meaningful group differences. Disparate treatment, on the other hand, is where you use completely different standards. So I give one group of people the Wonderlic and then give another group of people an internet IQ test. Using completely different standards would be disparate treatment. So how do you establish a disparate treatment case? If you find out from another applicant that you didn't go through the same selection procedure that they did, what would you say? Well, the plaintiff, you must belong to a protected group. You must have been applied and were qualified for the job. You have to have been rejected, and you have to show that the employer continued to find or to look for other applicants with the qualifications that you had. The defendant must then provide a legitimate non-discriminatory case for the rejection of this person. So let's, for example, say that they looked at your social media post and said, hey, we see that this person is using illegal drugs on their current job. We're not going to hire them. That might be a legitimate non-discriminatory case for why you were rejected, which is why you should keep a lot of stuff off of social media. So the defendant would have to provide a legitimate non-discriminatory case. The plaintiff must then argue that this reason for rejection is just a pretext, that you say it was about what you saw about me on Instagram, but I overheard you saying, and other people overheard you saying, that you would never hire someone who looked like me. That's just an example. And disparate treatment is really, really hard, though, to prove, because you basically have to prove motive, and that is it's harder to do than you would think. So I remember when I first took my IO classes, that this was the lesson I took away from here, is that disparate treatment cases are really, 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 really hard, and you kind of have to have a smoking gun in order to actually have success in arguing it. Adverse impact is much easier to argue and much easier to win. All right. The big doozy of them all, affirmative action. Affirmative action. It is not what you think it is, and I can't stress that enough. This is my soapbox moment, and there are a couple more coming up for this lecture, but affirmative action is not what you think it is. It's not what you think it is. It's probably not what you think it is, okay? Because when I first taught this class many eons ago, I had many students say that they thought affirmative action was unfair. They thought that it wasn't right, and how could people do that? It just perpetuates problems anyway. And that's because people think affirmative action is one thing when it really isn't that thing. So let's talk about what affirmative action actually is. So affirmative action are the actions that companies take, and universities too, for the record, take to seek out, develop, and recruit diverse applicant pools. And an affirmative action plan is just the outline of these actions and the strategies to achieve their goals. So how is this done? How is affirmative action achieved? You recruit underrepresented persons. So you do recruitment fairs at HBCUs. You do recruitment fairs at HSIs. You do recruitment fairs at schools that have a high level of first-generation college students. You do diversity training. So that's another thing internally that organizations do that's part of an affirmative action plan. Then you also have just the intentional examination and elimination of discriminatory practices. So you may develop a committee that's going to examine, okay, how can we assess cognitive ability in a way that isn't going to be discriminatory or result in adverse impact? Preferential hiring is where this does happen, and this is where also people get angry and start to say that this is reverse racism and that it's still morally wrong, and people who know what affirmative action actually is just kind of roll our eyes because it's a mischaracterization. It's a straw man argument, which is a logical fallacy, and look like a fool when you start to think that preferential hiring means what you think it means. So affirmative action is these things. It's basically trying to be intentional about how you can recruit people who are diverse, and diversity does benefit organizations. We can talk about that, and we will talk about that in our later sections, but let's assume and accept that argument because we can generally argue for it. So some people get worked up about preferential hiring. They think that what this means is that unqualified people get hired over qualified people, or in the case of college students, that they get accepted even though they're not qualified to be in college. And that's not it at all. Usually what happens when we're talking about preferential treatment is related to something known as banding. So when we are hiring people, we can generate their scores, their predictive performance scores or whatever score we have. And you can see here, there's my mouse, I have an applicant pool. So I have my applicant pool. These are like just names I pulled from the top 10 baby names. There's no rhyme or reason to them. So we can see here's our lowest score, Liam, and we go all the way up to Isabella. Isabella's our highest score. So let's say we only have 3 positions that we want to hire people for. So we offer to Isabella, Elijah, and Ava. That's what we would do if we just did a top-down thing, or rather we just looked at who scored the highest. But let's say we do have an affirmative action program. We want to increase our diversity. Well, then we might say to ourselves, okay, well, how meaningfully different is Isabella from Sophia? This could just be measurement error coming into play here, and that Isabella's true score isn't actually meaningfully different than Sophia's. And that's how we form these bands. We may say that, okay, and this is you use statistical analyses to do these. You basically say, okay, Isabella all the way to Sophia, all of these people that are in this range of scores aren't meaningfully different from each other. And so we could select within these top 4 people, the 3 people who are going to fill our position. And in that way, we may say, okay, Sophia is part of an underrepresented group. We are going to offer her the position as well as Ava and Elijah and not Isabella. And you may say, well, that's not fair. Isabella scored the highest. Yeah, but Isabella may also just have a true score that's equivalent to Sophia, and she just benefited from measurement error. So you can't tell, I'm very salty about these things, but that's how it operates. And that's where usually preferential hiring and preferential admissions how they happen. We form these bands and we say, okay, everyone in this band, using measurement and test theory, which we talked about at the beginning, at the beginning of the semester, all of these people we can statistically and reasonably assume effectively have the same true score. So basically, in other words, Isabella isn't quote unquote more qualified than Sophia is, because we believe they probably have close to the same true score, knowing what we know about measurement error and other statistical analyses. That's how preferential treatment, or rather preferential hiring, takes place. Like I said, there's this ridiculous perception that affirmative action means that people who are not qualified for a job get hired for it, which, like, for the record, has been going on for all history of humanity with things like nepotism and who knows who and the old boys club. So it's been going on, and the people who are doing it are probably not the people you're thinking who are doing it, or who you think of when you think of who affirmative action and preferential hiring and all of these biased hiring benefits. So that's my saltiness on that. But the point here, and I really want to drive this home because I want you all to leave this class with the knowledge of what preferential hiring actually means, is that preferential hiring means that we identify who is reasonably similar to each other and who is not. And from those groups of people, then we can make hiring decisions that can take into consideration diversity, can take into consideration what kind of workforce we want to generate. Like I said, the idea here is, theoretically, Isabel and Sophia, given what we know about classical test theory, are not actually probably meaningfully different. Their true score is actually probably close to the same, if not the same. It'd be the same down here. If we put a band around Liam, Olivia, and Noah, we would say that these 3 people probably aren't all that meaningfully different. 2.5 versus 2, probably not a huge meaningful difference. So that's usually how preferential hiring happens. It's not the hiring of unqualified people. It's not what it is. Affirmative action is also not a quota. Quota systems are only allowed if the government has mandated that you need to have a quota system. So sometimes if you've been accused of things like consistently, like a affirmative act or not affirmative action, like adverse impact and disparate treatment, the government may mandate that you need to balance that out and you need to address it by having a quota system. That's the only time you can have a quota system. Otherwise, quotas are actually illegal. This is the thing that drives me bananas about arguments about affirmative action, is everyone thinks it's a quota, and unless the government mandates that you have a quota, having a quota system is illegal, because you're basically still hiring based on race and ethnicity, which you cannot do. We'll talk about some exceptions to that, but quotas, affirmative action is not a quota. I'm going to keep saying that again and again because it's not. Like I said, you can have a quota when the government mandates it. Affirmative action is also not hiring unqualified people. I haven't said it loud enough. Affirmative action is not a quota. Affirmative action is not hiring unqualified people. If you leave this class with anything, it would be an accurate knowledge of what affirmative action is, because misperceptions of what it is do so much harm to people and organizations and makes people look like they don't know what they're talking about. So the case law around AAP, it's complicated, and most of the book examples are about education context, which is also hard to judge how much educational context carry over to hiring context, but for the sake of argument, let's just say these are the same or roughly the same. On the one hand, we have Gratz versus Bollinger. Gratz versus Bollinger basically said that, that in the particular selection system they were looking at, they basically overweighted and overconsidered the underrepresentation of the person. I believe like 20%, and this was a school, I think it was University of Michigan. They gave 20 points automatically to anybody who belonged in an underrepresented group, and the court basically said that's too much. You're overweighting diversity. On the other hand, you have had lots of other cases that show that diversity is a viable consideration for organizations, especially like a business consideration for organizations to consider. And so in that way, making a strategic hiring decision based on diversity does serve a business purpose, and in that way may be prudent. And in the case of schools, that diversity is a compelling interest for schools. The issue is also the justification for why is it a compelling interest and how much do you overweigh it. So Grutter versus Bollinger basically said that because race was not allocated a specific number of points, but rather just generally considered in the selection system, that it wasn't as problematic as Gratz versus what happened in Gratz versus Bollinger. Petit versus City of Chicago also showed that you can consider who is being served, and we'll get to this with BFOQs too in a second, you can consider who's being served by your organization when hiring people. So in that case, it was deemed a viable business interest for the City of Chicago to hire people who were representative of the community that they would be policing. Parents versus Seattle School District was effectively the same thing, that racial composition could be considered when deciding which students get into which schools in terms of representativeness. Fisher versus Austin, University of Texas at Austin, is a very interesting case with quite possibly the most unsympathetic plaintiff in the history of all plaintiffs. But Fisher basically argued, that she was not given admission to the University of Texas at Austin over relatively unqualified individuals. And the Supreme Court once again acknowledged that diversity is a viable consideration, and that when it's, more narrowly defined and narrowly considered and not allotted a huge ton of points and not a tipping point factor for application decisions, that race and diversity in other ways could be considered in decisions when hiring people and when selecting people into a college. So it's never that race can be the deciding factor, that we'll talk about BFOQs in a second, but rather that it can be considered just in a very narrow capacity, or if there's a business interest related to that. And we'll, like I said, talk about that with BFOQs. So the case law is complicated. Just to remind you, affirmative action is not a quota. Affirmative action is not hiring of unqualified people. Let's talk about the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Pay Act gets more about how you compensate your employees, which obviously should be based on your job analysis. But we had to make a law that said it's illegal to pay women and men unequally for equal jobs. The difficulty, though, is engaging whether jobs are equal or what is equal work. The only way that you can judge this is through job analysis. And the courts have often had to come in and, basically gauge on a case-by-case basis what isn't equal work. One issue that came up with the Equal Pay Act is that when usually women try to sue companies for being relatively underpaid, there was a statute of limitations. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, though, effectively made sure that there was no statute of limitations on unequal pay claims. So, progress. And so here we see JFK signing this legislation. No comment about the fact that it's mostly white women and certain people got left out of women's progress for a very long time. Actually, that is a comment about it, but this isn't a done deal though. With the landscape of the Supreme Court changing, it's very possible that some equal pay efforts could be undermined. And with legislation being passed by certain people, this could also be undermined. So this is once again one of those situations where you would want to stay up to date on things, because apparently the idea that you should be paid equally for the work that you do is not an idea that is shared by everyone. So it's not a done deal. And with things changing, you just might want to be on the lookout for that. The next set of legal precedent that we'd want to look at is the Civil Rights Act. This was landmark legislation brought on by the civil rights movement, led by figures such as Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., etc. It basically argued or made into law that you cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. We'll talk about what these mean, I think, in a little bit. Yeah. You could discriminate based on these things before. I mean, people discriminated with impunity for a very long time. I mean, a very long time. And not just against people of color, though it definitely happened against people of color. After Reconstruction, people were not happy with the power that people of color were having in this country. And that's how we ended up with a system of Jim Crow laws that effectively kept people of color from achieving the same gains that white people did. So yeah, discrimination happened before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It also happened against religious minorities, or rather religious non-powerful people. You also saw this with certain immigrant groups who were, white, but not liked by other people. This was suffered, and though this is still hotly debated in the field of history, by Irish Catholics in particular. So here you can see this is a set of wanted ads, and here you can see no Irish need apply. This was totally legal to do. You could put this in a job posting. Or here, she must be a Protestant. I mean, you couldn't do that now unless it was a BFOQ. Here is a Protestant, German Protestant preferred, Protestant women or woman. So, and then let's see, Protestant woman, Scotch preferred. So you could openly say that. For the record, people still do it, and it's kind of ridiculous, and they definitely get lambasted for it, as they should. But you could do this before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now you can't do it unless you have a BFOQ, which, like I said, we'll talk about in a second. So this is a very grainy photo of LBJ signing this into effect with, like I said, grainy picture of MLK there as well. So what do these mean? Race gets into whether you identify with a certain racial group. Of course, race is a problematic social construct that has very little genetic basis and is more based on a social idea of what differentiates us from other people. The African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. has a really good exhibit of how our concept and construct of race is not as, it's more recent than you think it is. So if this pandemic ever ends and you can go to D.C., I highly recommend that. The color of your skin, that's just straightforward, because race and the color of your skin are, once again, not as correlated as I think some people think they are. Religion, the religious faith you practice or lack thereof. This can apply to protections to people who don't have a religious faith as well. sex. This is gender or biological sex. This was recently expanded. I'll talk about that in a second. And it includes pregnancy and pregnancy status, national origin, which is where you are from, and related manifestations like the way you talk. So subsequent cases that follow the Civil Rights Act. So what happens is basically Congress or a state or whoever passes a law, and then lawsuits happen based on the interpretation of that law, and the courts then decide how those laws can be interpreted. That's how the whole checks and balances of this country should work. So Griggs versus Duke Power was a case where Griggs was an African-American man. He was denied a job. He and his lawyer showed that there was adverse impact, and Duke Power said, but we didn't mean to. And the court said, it doesn't matter if you didn't mean to. It doesn't matter if you didn't mean to engage in discrimination when it comes to adverse impact cases. Their selection tool also wasn't validated, which goes to show you validation studies are key. That's how they couldn't defend their use of their selection tool, because they didn't have the data to do so. So do it so you don't get, well, do it because it's the right thing to do, but do it because you're going to get sued if you don't. Or you're going to get sued and you'll lose. You'll lose. That's more important. The next one is Ritchie versus DiStefano. This was a really interesting case because a civil service examination resulted in adverse impact. And so the organization decided to actually throw out the results, and white and Hispanic candidates, I believe, they sued. And they won. And the reason that they won is that the city basically should not have thrown out the results, because throwing out those results was a race-based consideration. And even though it was in the favor of underrepresented individuals, it was still a decision based on race. Moreover, the city would have been fine and could have had a strong legal defense if they did exactly what I said in the previous slide. Acknowledge that they had adverse impact, but that the civil service examination was predictive of job performance. Because they threw it out, they actually did themselves more harm than good. So sometimes things on the face of it that look like you're doing the right thing, or being considerate of race and diversity, can actually do you more harm than good. So it's Ritchie versus DiStefano is a fascinating case. Now, like I said, subsequent cases have continue to interpret what the provisions of the Civil Rights Act mean. So this year, and your textbook was written before this case, ruling came out, this year the Supreme Court judged that sexual orientation and gender identity were protected under the Civil Rights Act, under the concept of sex. So whether you're LGBTQIA or gender nonconforming, or what your gender identity is, those things are protected under the Civil Rights Act. But these things will keep changing though, and it doesn't mean that everything is rainbows and lollipops for everyone. And I mean that in the sense of things being, forward-looking and progressive. What I mean is that there will be, a lot of legislation, depending on what happens over the next few months, that could actually continue to restrict our concept of what sex means in the Civil Rights Act. For example, in the military, we find that there is now a reinstated transgender ban. Basically, you have to adhere to your birth sex, or you can't be in the military. And there are limits to the healthcare coverage you could get for that. And so these things will keep changing. In this past year, like I said, we saw that the interpretation of what it meant for LGBTQIA and gender identity status, that the Civil Rights Act was expanded to include that, but we still haven't really actually explicitly dealt with transgender issues. And that's probably a case that's going to come before the Supreme Court in the next few years, whether transgender identity is also covered under the sex provision of the Civil Rights Act. So those are how, that's where things could be going in the future. So I keep alluding to BFOQs. BFOQs refer to bona fide occupational qualifications. These are certain religions, races, genders, ethnicities that we need to hire for a position, that we have a business legitimate reason to hire for a position. This is extremely narrowly defined. It's often judged on a case-by-case basis by the courts. And when you try to invoke a BFOQ, you do open yourself up for a lawsuit that you could very well lose, because the court's rulings on BFOQs are extremely specific and extremely idiosyncratic. I'll give some examples of those in a second. So here's some BFOQs. Should an airline attendant have to be a woman? Well, Pan Am, I think, tried to argue that, and the court said, nope, Sex appeal is not part of the business that you provide. Does a wet nurse have to be a woman, so a person who breastfeeds another person's baby? Yes. Do guards in a women's prison have to be women? Generally, yes, but there are very specific like splitting of hairs as to whether or not this can actually be the case. Jesuit priests or Jesuit individuals for Jesuit schools, the Jesuit order is a specific order in the Catholic Church, and it's a specific perspective on Catholicism. Yes, and we'll talk about churches more in a second. Hooters girls, Playboy bunnies, do they have to be women? It's been generally argued that yes, they can be. Hooters often settles out of court when men sue for trying to get a job there, but it's complicated though, because the legal precedent requires that you would have to prove that the essence of your business is to sell sex, or that in order for the experience of your business to be authentic and your employees' provision of that business to be authentic, they have to be of a certain race, gender, ethnicity, etc. That's what you would have to prove, and that's really hard to do. So can you also then limit actors to certain BFOQs? Yes, this gets at this idea of authenticity. So you can reasonably say, I need a white man to play Abraham Lincoln. I need a black actor to play Martin Luther King Jr. I'm having a role that depicts a transgender person. I need a transgender person. And so for the purposes of authenticity, you can get away with this. So if you're ever wondering, well, why does the cast of Hamilton get to hire whoever they want to fill those positions who isn't white? It's because they have a legitimate interest in the authenticity of the artist's expression that is related to the people in the cast largely being people of color. So related to the Civil Rights Act, sexual harassment also is an extension of the sex provision of the Civil Rights Act. So you can have two different kinds of sexual harassment: quid pro quo sexual harassment, which is where you exchange sexual favors for advancement in an organization. So this would be like what Harvey Weinstein would do. Hostile work environment, on the other hand, is where there's verbal or physical behavior that creates a negative work environment. I believe this has been a problem that's plagued Fox News a lot. It's considered effectively a form of sex-based discrimination. So that's how it gets covered under the Civil Rights Act. And this continues to be an issue. In spite of the Civil Rights Act being around now for well over half a century, we still continue to see that sexual harassment is a problem, and it just won't go away until we start doing different things about how we deal with sexual harassment. But it is an issue that continues to, as I said, be an issue. Another thing that we see related to legal precedent that impacts employment decisions is the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. You cannot discriminate against people over the age of 40 because of their age. Interestingly enough, you can discriminate against young people based on their age, which, as still an elder millennial, is just kind of insulting. But I don't make the laws. So you can't discriminate against people who are over the age of 40. Like I said, though, if you say, I don't want to hire someone because they're too young and they're under the age of 40, legally speaking, you can get away with that. Age can sometimes, though, be a BFOQ. So if I were to say that I need a security guard who's under the age of 50 because we need someone who is quick on their feet and isn't suffering, the mental decline that inevitably happens to all of us, we can say, we can say that this job can't be fulfilled by this person, and that's legitimate. Of course, you'd have to prove it to the courts. And it has to be for a job that makes sense, like airline pilots, for example. We don't want someone over a certain age when they start to suffer mental and visual impairments to be flying a plane with hundreds of people on it that can cause major issues and death if things go wrong. In order to establish a case of age discrimination, you have to be over 40, do satisfactory work, be removed from your position, presumably because of your age, and replaced by someone younger. The most critical thing here is proving that you were doing satisfactory work. And this is why, as an organization, it's critical to assess your employees' performance so you can say, no, we removed Joe because he wasn't doing a good job anymore, not because he is old. So The next case or next set of laws that impact employment decisions is Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't discriminate based on a disability. A disability is a physical or mental impairment that can limit your activities. You have to have a record of having the impairment and be regarded as having the impairment. The interpretation of being regarded as having an impairment is kind of complicated, but you can't just show up and say, I have a disability. You usually have to have some sort of documentation or formal acknowledgement that you have the disability, which does present its own issues because getting records of disabilities is actually very expensive, especially if it's a learning disability or a cognitive disability. You must also be qualified to do the job. So you can't sue a company for not giving you a job if you are unqualified for the job and have a disability. You can't say, oh, you didn't hire me because of my disability if they can prove that you weren't qualified. So you have to be qualified for a job. You also have to be able to be reasonably accommodated for the job. So the organization must be able to reasonably accommodate the person. And so for example, the book gives a really great one that says, you know, if lifting heavy boxes is not a critical feature of the person's job, and you can find ways to accommodate them not doing it, like getting someone else to do it or giving them tools to help them lift boxes, then you can reasonably accommodate that job. If, however, you're working in an Amazon warehouse and you are confined to a wheelchair, it would be very difficult for you to do the tasks required of you to be an Amazon warehouse worker. So in that way, Amazon could argue that this person cannot do the job without us experiencing undue hardship in accommodating it. So you'd probably have to develop some sort of crazy technology for the person to be able to get up to the boxes that they need and whatnot. And Amazon could argue, and this is where we get to undue hardship, that to accommodate the person would be too expensive. And so reasonable accommodations, you know, an organization can get around this and say, hey, we can't hire this person because we can't provide a reasonable accommodation without experiencing undue financial hardship. So that's not saying that you want to get away from hiring people with disabilities, but this is one way organizations can say, hey, we can't hire this person. It would cost us millions of dollars to accommodate them. So the last act that we're going to talk about is the Family and Medical Leave Act. This refers to where you can take up to 12 weeks unpaid leave for family-related health issues or serious health conditions for yourself or family. Most people think about this in terms of pregnancy and having children. The idea of the legislation is that you have to be able to return to your position or an equivalent position. So FMLA, contrary to popular belief, does not guarantee that it's not paid medical leave. California, I believe, is the only state that requires people to have paid medical leave by their organization. A lot of states don't necessarily have that, or it's very limited in its scope. Like you have to be a state worker, you're a federal worker, you can't be a civil worker, you can't impose this upon private organizations. So FMLA does not guarantee paid leave. It just guarantees unpaid leave, and that when you come back, you will have a job and you can maintain and retain your benefits over the course of your FMLA. You still have to pay your premiums, and it gets really complicated. FMLA is not the wonderful thing that a lot of people think it is in terms of what it leaves out. So for example, FMLA can force you to exhaust your sick leave depending on the organization you work for. So you could work for an organization that says, oh, we offer paid leave, and then you come to find out that their concept of paid leave is FMLA, where you have to use all of your sick time. They're not giving you, on top of your sick time, additional paid leave. In my opinion, it should be illegal, but it is not. Your organization can say, if you want to take FMLA, you're going to have to use all of your sick days, which, imagine if you're in the scenario where you are a woman and you're pregnant and you're going to have your baby at the beginning of January. Do you really want to say to yourself, oh, I'm going to exhaust my sick leave and hope I don't get sick or my child doesn't get sick for the rest of the year where I would need those sick days? Moreover, FMLA, like I said, it's unpaid. And so because of that, what it means is, you know, people will have their job protected, but how many people can take 12 weeks of unpaid leave? Most families can't sustain that. So we do not have federal laws guaranteeing paid medical leave. We do have a law that allows you to take unpaid medical leave. So just wanted to clarify what FMLA does and what it does not do, because there's some misconceptions surrounding that as well. Remember, most of this is federal law. So what this means is that there can be local jurisdictions like states and cities that have their own set of laws that impact employment decisions. So if you become an IO or HR professional, you will need to be aware of what the local jurisdiction says as well, because there are some states and cities that offer expanded protections for individuals based on things like genetic status, and that can include things like having a genetic risk factor for something, or things like transgender identity. These things aren't universally protected. And so your awareness as an HR professional, an IO professional, or even someone who's just starting their own startup, or what this means is that if you occupy any of those roles, you have to be aware of what the laws say. Ignorance of the law does not protect you from being subject to it. And another thing to remember, these case precedents keep changing. And like I said, a lot of it ends up being an exercise in splitting hairs. So we talked about, for example, that you can basically have BFOQs for certain things and not for others, but that for example, the Civil Rights Act sex coverage includes sexual identity and sexual orientation. But the Supreme Court recently ruled that, for example, those laws don't protect teachers in Catholic schools, because individuals who are teachers in religious organizations are considered ministers, and therefore the BFOQs you can use to fire and hire them are expanded. So in these cases that are here, I don't think this was actually someone fired for LGBTQ status. I think the actual case in question was someone who was fired because they had a medical issue. And you should look at the case. It's fascinating. But what this does mean is that there are schools in Indianapolis, for example, that have fired their LGBTQIA teachers, Catholic schools that have fired their LGBTQIA teachers. And what the Supreme Court decision basically now says, in spite of previously ruling that the Civil Rights Act protects people who are LGBTQIA under the sex provision, that in the case of churches and Catholic schools in particular, they can discriminate because it is basically a BFOQ applied to a minister of the church, because teachers are considered ministers. Like I said, it's fascinating, and these things are seemingly contradictory, and that's why it's critical to be aware of what the various case laws say, because ultimately sometimes the Supreme Court is just in the business of splitting hairs. So while generally you can't discriminate based on LGBTQIA status, if you are in a church for certain positions, you can, depending, of course, on your religious organization and what religion you are, or what religion the organization is. So the point here is that case law changes, and our interpretation of these laws, including the Civil Rights Act, changes, and it can be remedied and rectified based on having a new set of Supreme Court judges. It can be changed based on who is sitting on the bench. They can reinterpret and reissue new interpretations of the law. So none of this is actually really ever set in stone. And so we always need to be diligent and watchful as IO professionals, IO psychologists, and HR professionals about what has changed in our legal landscape. So like I said, this is a really long lecture. I'm very sorry. Hopefully next week won't be as lengthy. And that's it.